There's always the questionable cases where it's hard to tell whether it's AOL or not, and then you just sort of, that's the art part of remote viewing. It's not a science, it's an art. Well, it's sort of a science, it's sort of an art. There are scientific parts, and there are parts where it's just skill. Practice over time, you sort of learn what you can trust and what you can't.
Is it true that I read in your book that the more you practice, it's almost like exercise, the better you get at it? If you practice it properly?
Yes, that's right. In general terms, that's correct. Practice always helps, right? But if you are practicing a mistaken approach, then you may just be making it worse for yourself. So the idea is always pay attention and always go for what seems to be working. You always need to have feedback when you're done. You need to take your session, be able to compare it against ground truth so that you can see where you went wrong, where you went right. And if you get that, then you have some trial and error that enters in and can help you get more of a concrete, a better grasp on the process and have more success. In theory, you should actually get more consistent in producing good results.
What is a tachyon? Because I know that was mentioned early in the book, Reading the Enemy's Mind.
Tachyon is a theoretical particle. We're talking the level of quarks and photons down to the quantum level. It's a theoretical particle that has some capacity to go backwards in time. So far, they have not ever identified the actual tachyons, and they're not absolutely sure they really exist. But postulating tachyons actually helps some of these theories work. Now, you have to be careful with some of the quantum physics theories because they invent things in order to make the theory actually work. And usually they have good reasons for inventing them, but until you actually find where that thing is there or not, you can't necessarily say the theory is true. So tachyons are one of those things that were postulated in a certain theory that if you postulated the existence of these particles that could kind of go backwards in time, then that would make the theory work, and then the theory explains a whole bunch of other stuff that really does make sense. So we think that maybe the tachyons are real as well. But no one's ever been able to actually show that they exist. So,
got you. Can we go back to the signal line again and clarify that?
Yes. In fact, it sticks in my mind that there was something else I was going to say, but I don't remember what that was. Well, I'm sure it'll come back to me if it's important, right? So the signal line itself, we don't know what it is. I talked about the matrix earlier.
Yes.
And it may well be that the matrix, as it's conceived, is just a model, that matrix is actually a bit different. And it may be different in this way. It may actually be the universe itself at the quantum level. What do I mean by that? Well, there was a physicist, David Bohm, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and he proposed that the universe could be taken in two different ways. One was what he called the explicit order, which is the order of the world we're in. Chairs, computers, people, those are all members of the explicit order, the bigger picture of the universe. But then there's the implicit order. The opposite of that, he said, was the implicit order. And the implicit order is actually the same world we were just talking about, but taken at the subatomic, the quantum level. So in that order, all there is a mass of particles, of quarks and photons and gluons and whatever all the other particles are that are here and there and the ones they're looking for. And at that level, the universe, of course, looks differently. If we could get down to that level and look, we would just see a whole bunch of particles around, and we wouldn't have the same landmarks of chairs and tables and all that kind of thing. But, okay, so far that's just a different way of looking at it. What difference does that make? Well, here's where it becomes relevant. There's a thing called quantum nonlocality, or quantum entanglement, which is a very interesting feature of physics where if you take two particles, two photons, let's say, and they are very closely associated in some environment, you entangled them, they become sister photons, you split them up and you have one on one side of the universe and the other on the other side of the universe. There is still some kind of connection between the two. So if you change an attribute on one photon, that same attribute on the other photon will also change in the opposite direction. And it's instant, and it doesn't have any causal interaction that causes it. So it violates the speed of light because there is no speed involved. You can go from one side of the universe to the other in effecting this change without any time elapsing whatsoever. This is all proved out mathematically and experimentally, by the way.
That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
So you have this entanglement, this non-locality. And so the question is, how do you get things entangled? Well, you have them very closely associated in the past. Well, wait a minute. The whole universe at one point, if the Big Bang Theory is correct, and it's pretty much universally accepted, there are some disagreeers, but if the Big Bang Theory is correct, then the entire universe at one point before the Big Bang was crammed into a thing called a singularity. A singularity violates the laws of physics because it is a location, it is a thing that has no dimension and yet contains everything.
Is that related to Ray Kurzweil's work?
Could be. Okay. I'm not real familiar.
I never heard the definition of the singularity the way you just gave it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's basically what it is. That's why they call it singularity, because it's quite singular. I don't know. but at any rate, a Big Bang, of course, that singularity essentially exploded, although there's probably a more technical way of describing that, and expanded into the universe. Space is created as the matter in it expands into what now has become the universe. But the interesting thing is that you don't get more closely associated than being in a space with no dimension, and yet everything is there. So everything at some point was very closely associated with the suggestion that maybe everything is entangled with everything else. And so you have these possible influences between all particles in the universe. And so it may well be that what happens in a remote viewing session is that the viewer, through his or her subconscious, goes into brain function, and the fundamental layers of brain functioning are quantum processes. So get involved in the brain functioning at the quantum level and are able then to access any point in the universe through this non-local function, and therefore obtain information from any corner of the universe, mostly here on the planet, but anywhere else in theory, right? And so that information just comes in through the non-local process. So it isn't really a signal, it isn't really a line, there is nothing going back and forth, and yet the information just comes based on this.
It's a capacity, though.
I'm sorry?
It's a capacity.
It's a capacity, I guess. We really don't have a good word to describe it, and that's probably as good as any in this case.
So are we all one? So with that said, which is remarkable, could it be said that then you and me and the universe and all of us are connected as one organism, an intelligent organism on some level?
Well, you say we're connected, whether how far that unity goes, I don't know. But this is interesting because Doug Adams, the guy that wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he also wrote a book called Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, and the whole book is premised on this idea of the interconnectedness of all things.
It sounds like from the remote viewing work that you've done in the model and the teaching that it's something that we end up accessing and finding out at some point, that connectedness is beyond our conscious mind.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, yeah.
Talk about the mental noise that goes on in the remote viewing learning and what people have to deal with when they're being trained regarding mental noise. Some of it you talked about related to analytical overlay.
Yeah, it is. And the largest component of mental noise is analytical overlay, but there are other species as well. One is environmental overlay, where features in your environment can creep in unawares and end up in your session. I mean, they discovered this back with in some of their early sessions. Of course, this is the early 70s, and you had orange shag carpet on the floor and turquoise walls, and there are picture sailboats, who knows what, right? So the viewer might be going along and describe something that's orange and fuzzy and turquoise and pictures and talk about sailing or something like that. And the target might be, I don't know, the Eiffel Tower, right? There's nothing orange and fuzzy there. It's not turquoise and there's no sailboats. So where'd that come from? And then they'd look around the room and say, oh, it leaked in from the environment. So we learned to deal with that. There are also inclemencies, which are, the problems you may be having, emotional, situational problems, things you've got to worry about, errands you have to run, that your mind is trying to keep in mind so that you don't forget things that are bugging you, and you have to get that out in order to do a clean remote viewing session. So you learn how to compartmentalize that temporarily before you before you go on with your session, and that helps